Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello.
How's it going, Remy?
Good, good. How are you?
Doing all right. Doing all right.
You're not too tired from the workshop?
Yeah, no, it is. It was a bit. It was like, whatever it was, 8:30 to like 10 p.m. one day, but not all of it was the workshop. Like the last, between like 6 and 10 p.m. was like dinner but we were still chatting over like a lot of stuff. So that was one day, and then the next day it was like 10 a.m. to what was it? It was still like 10 a.m. to like 6 p.m. or so.
That's a lot.
Yeah. And while we're waiting for some more folks, feel free to add your attendance to the meeting. And if there's anything else for the agenda that folks wanted to add. Right, for folks who are joining now, just feel free to put your attendance in the meeting. Oh, can folks hear me? Okay. Yeah, cool. Yeah, we can hear you. Okay, cool. All right, we can just a reminder one more time, as folks are joining in, feel free to put your attendance into the meeting and anything else you want to add to the agenda here. And let me also make sure I have the Fresca pipeline library stuff open. All right. Okay, so we can get started. So just as a reminder to folks, this meeting is being recorded. It'll be uploaded to YouTube shortly after. And also your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF Code of Conduct. So before getting into the agenda, is there anybody who is new to this community meeting who wants to introduce themselves?
I can start. This is my first meeting. So, hey, I'm Zach Yanish. I'm part of IBM, working with Brandon on the city project, and see some other city folks on here as well. So nice to meet y'all.
Nice to have you. All right, so we can get into it. So I know there's been, between, like, I guess, beginning of December till now, there's been a lot of different planning meetings and yada that folks have been sort of pulled into. So I know we haven't had too much regular attendance to this meeting, but hoping moving forward we can do that. So the agenda item I have for this week, but also open to other agenda items if folks have anything, is kind of talking over a little bit of the high level 2023 roadmap items that we wanted to sort of focus on. And some of this is in line with some of the high level OpenSSF guidance. So like the Sterling toolchain integration coming from the governing board. And actually some of the folks over at City might have some more insight onto some of that, because I know that John is heavily invested in the Sterling toolchain stuff that's coming out of OpenSSF. Cool. So before getting into like details on the roadmap, does anybody have any sort of general questions, comments, anything like that?
So just a note, I noticed that the git clone task got updated in place. And so the hash, the 256 hash is wrong. So I'm putting together a PR for that, just so people know. So if you see a build that breaks because of that, that's why. So there's a fix on the way.
Okay.
Wait, how did that happen? They got changed in place? What do you mean?
So they have the tasks underneath a version number. So like the git clone is under 0.9. They adjusted the configuration of the git clone task there without actually forking a new
version
of it.
So,
Oh, so
hash.
upstream at the catalog, you mean?
Yep.
Oh, I see. Okay. Got it.
yeah.
Version penning is hard.
Yeah. Hey, that's something that we're looking to actually catch with stuff like Walk, is to say, hey, somebody updated a release without actually updating the version number or the hash, or yeah, pretty much that sort of thing, because it is quite annoying. Cool. Yeah. That sounds good. And actually, I know one of the ticket items we have is, well, not quite that, but related, which is one of the things I think we would like to see for 2023 is a better way of updating the hashes of images as things get updated for like pipelines and for tasks and so on. I know that doesn't really affect this thing because this was sort of a version, like the hash change without the version actually changing. Yeah, so there's that. What else here? What else was I going to do? So the other big one, actually, before getting into pipeline framework and library, which I think is going to be the big ticket item, wanted to talk briefly a bit about some of the talks and the Sterling toolchain stuff for folks who are maybe not super familiar. So Salsa is looking to give a couple of talks, and they're viewing sort of Fresca, given that's part of the supply chain integrity working group, as kind of like a sort of key piece of some of that. So they're looking to give some talks at Open Source Summit and some other places soon, like something like, because there's also well, Jay's not here today, but there's the S2C2F, right? Which is this standard that's similar to Salsa, but it's more on the consumption side. So it's more like, here is a set of standards and policies for consuming artifacts, whereas Salsa is more of, here's a set of standards and policies and whatever for producing artifacts. And so they're looking to sort of combine where we can, right? S2C2F, Salsa, and then Fresca as sort of a way of doing it, and start giving talks around that. And so they're interested in folks who might be willing to help out with that, as well as just folks who maybe just want to get involved. So just keep that in mind. So the idea here would be, you might think through is like Fresca might be a thing that, let's say, consumes S2C2F, like artifacts that are compliant with it, like dependencies and whatnot, does a bunch of building, and then produces Salsa compliant artifacts on the outside. So that's something that's kind of, and that's also a big push as part of the Salsa 1.0 release, as well as part of some of the guidance coming from the governing board and the TAC, which is just like, hey, we want to start showing off actual implementation stuff on some of these things, and actually those implementation things being part of the OpenSSF itself. So this is stuff like Fresca being potentially a secure build tool that people can use. So that's actually also another thing for potentially maybe having actually a release this year might be nice to, even if it's like a beta release and not a full like 1.0 sort of hardened release. I think we're looking to kind of have something like a pretty soon, at least maybe have something like a v0.1. Because another thing that came up in a couple of other general OpenSSF meetings is people are sort of looking at Fresca and going, well, is there a release of this thing? How do I actually do this? Even if it's, even if we say it's an alpha release, it's not intended for production. People just don't know how to look at it yet. So that's another thing that I think we want to kind of get done this year, is start creating something like a release process. Tied to that, I think, is the Dependabot ability to update versions of things, and that's both on the components we're actually pushing out. I know that Tim has done some work on the vendor me stuff, which then I know is now part of the build sec work itself. So I'd be curious if folks have any thoughts on that. Do people think that we will be in some kind of releasable state in, let's say, by the summer? Like, not necessarily saying production release, but being able to kind of say, you run this command and you can deploy at least the standard Fresca, not necessarily a highly customizable one, but by the summer.
Yeah, I think the issue with Fresca has always been what exactly is a release of Fresca exactly. Because the way that we put it, the way that it's set up on GitHub right now is really more for users of Fresca to get it running, or sorry, developers of Fresca to get it running, as opposed to what somebody would actually consume. So I think if we maybe slot a demo of some of the stuff that Sunny's been working on in terms of splitting up Fresca into effectively the two distinct kinds of clusters in what would be a more representative environment, then releasing the actual pipeline piece of Fresca, I think, is something that we could definitely do by summer. Releasing what we have right now, I'm not even sure is a thing that we would want to do, because I don't think that's really how folks would even use it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so that definitely makes sense, and I think so. It's as a big goal there, I think, is we need to first defining what a release of Fresca even is, I think, is something that we'd want to do. And I think, yeah, we'd be interested in seeing a demo from Sunny on some of the stuff he's been working on, because I think kind of going back to sort of the principles in the README, right? Like, Fresca is a set of components that are open source components that are configured to operate securely, right? With recognizing that security means lots of different things, but just generally, like, in the general sort of sense of, like, yeah, we run this and we believe that it's harder to compromise a build based on these factors, maybe not being able to compromise everything. And also, we do have some folks who are working on a threat model on Fresca soon. But I think that sort of thing is something that we're interested in maybe locking down a bit more, to say, yep, and that's the principles, and then this is how we're actually hitting, the sort of goals defined there. And then separately, the Fresca being like an easy set of abstractions that, as an end user, right? So that's I think more for like the person who's running Fresca, and then for the end user who plans to actually use Fresca as a build tool, how do we make sure that it's as dead simple as possible for folks using Q or whatever to run builds without necessarily needing to write a ton of boilerplate code around, here is the key Verno policy that I'm associating with this build, and here is the here is some information regarding, like, the what's it called, secrets and config maps and all that good stuff. Like, it should just be something that is kind of like all one holistic package while remaining relatively flexible. So if folks need to add and change stuff, they should be able to.
Is there any work being done right now to create sort of like a wrapper tool around Fresco, like a command line tool, like turn it into an actual runnable command line tool and application? I think that would make it a lot more consumable by end users.
Yeah, so I think that actually ties literally into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is the sort of Fresca pipeline and framework and library. And so give me 1 second and I'll share my screen. And a lot of this is obviously built on the work that Brad has mostly done. So there's two pieces. One is we want to make that command line wrapper as simple as possible, right? Because we don't want to end up creating something that becomes so tied into how a lot of that sort of stuff works. So that's kind of where the Q stuff comes in, and I'll show off the Q stuff, and then we can talk a little bit about how that might interact. Sure. So let me share my screen here. Is it this one? Yes. Okay. Let me actually delete this for now because it's not working. And just as an FYI, the folks also from Q are interested in maybe in the next couple of weeks, maybe showing up to the next meeting or something like that, because they're very interested in seeing what they could also do to see how, like, what are we struggling with, and so on. But let me just show you like what this might look like potentially as an end user. Once again, this is purely a POC. This is not intended to be, actually production here. Right, so you might imagine somebody has, a project that looks like this, right? Where, in fact, actually, let me expand this a little bit. Where, they just say like, hey, my project name is this, my build type is this, let's say, and here's where my repository lives. And they want to be able to go and deploy a Fresca pipeline and everything else, like the policies associated with that pipeline, yada, yada. They're like, I'm an end user, I don't care, right? I like, if my org has a bunch of stuff, that's great. I just want to use that stuff. And as folks who've known, who've worked at like very large enterprises before, usually it's like, you must follow all the rules and you must know what all those rules are and implement all the rules yourself. And so that's kind of where this comes in. And this is also where something like this would probably be wrapped by the command line tool. But for now, we're just using Q directly just to kind of show off some stuff. If I do this, you can see it generates all, like from just this one YAML file, it generates all of this configuration, like, the Cube API secrets, cluster role bindings, some various policies that are associated with different things, and creates also the whatchamacallit, anyway, just various rules and the actual pipeline itself. And so what Q allows us to do, right, is Q allows us to constrain stuff and develop almost like a set of types by which we can define those pipelines. And the thing that's, you can do is at every level, you can sort of say, let's say at the org level, the org has a set of constraints, and then a department in an org could have a set of constraints. And once again, this is all very flexible to whatever the end user needs, but we'll obviously have some defaults here. But the basic idea is like, if a department has additional constraints, those constraints have to be additional. Like a department can't say, as an example, and I'll show this in a second, like if let's say the org says, we only support Python, Go, and Rust. If somebody comes in with C++, a department says, hey, we support C++. Sorry, the org doesn't support C++. We don't allow that, right? And that's kind of a simple example, but you could imagine like policy, and you could imagine naming schemes and all that sort of stuff being generated here. So you'll see here at the team level, there's a constraint on build type to Go and build packs. So that means if I switch this to Go and run the same thing, it now gets the Go pipeline associated with the project. But if I go in and I were to say like, I don't know, I want to use the Python builder. And this is also where the command line would come in to help with some of the error handling. But pretty much this is just saying, hey, there is a conflict here because you set up a constraint that says either build packs or go, and you gave me Python, right? And the command line here would create better end user sort of error messages. But this is kind of the thing that, you know, is allowed and what isn't allowed, right? And so the other thing here, right, is so if I push this back to build packs, and let's say, you know, I removed build packs, that would no longer work as well. The other things here are, you know, you can potentially inject additional sort of constraints or whatever, additional resources into the Kubernetes that we're using for Q, also via this same sort of mechanism. So here we've just defined a almost like Q doesn't have functions, but something similar to a function in Q that allows us to say, hey, I want to create a policy, a Kyverno policy. In this case, it's a Kyverno image policy, and it's called Baz. And I'm expecting images of the form Baz/something, and the key that those images should be signed with are this key, right? And once again, this is purely a POC. But if you look up here, and if I go over here, there is sort of, it generated this policy here. And if I were to create a new policy and so on, that could go in there as well. And also you can see here, there's like a couple of extra sort of values here, like the team, right? And the department has its own sort of value. And then the org here has a bunch of information on its constraints. So here, there's a bunch of policies that are associated with at the org level. But because we don't restrict it at the lower levels, we can say, okay, a department is allowed to create additional policies, but they can't delete the org's policies, right? They could say, hey, we have additional stuff and so on. And then over here, here's the like complete list of allowed builds. So if I were to go back up to here and said, well, go and build packs are the only ones, but if I wanted to say, hey, let me create Python, this will work. But as soon as I were to go and change this to Python, it's going to go and say, hey, this is not an element of the, it's pretty much just sort of saying, hey, this is not an element of that list. So there's no, even though it's technically allowed, there is nothing at the org level to actually support that. So that's another sort of thing there. In addition to that, we can set up stuff like naming schemes as part of this, so that, you know, an individual organization can come in and say, great, all of my images that are built should look in the form of org-department-team-project. And if I look at this here, you can see it creates images in that sort of form here of like ttl.sh, which is the default as part of which I'll show you what that looks like in the library in a second. But it's org-x-department-y-team-z-foo, right? And where foo only had to just say, what's my project name, foo? And you know, some of us who've worked in banks have known, like, sometimes there is a naming scheme out there. You're not told what that naming scheme is, and you just kind of have somebody go and say, like, no, you have to, it is, you know, the first letter of the office you work out of plus the, you know, and there's a lot of this sort of stuff. Whereas here, the idea is like, we want to make that auto-generated where somebody can define that policy, and this automatically fills in the blanks for you. And so a lot of this stuff, right, is built on top of what Brad had built. And also, once again, a lot of things I'm doing in here are probably not Q best practices. I'm still trying to figure some of that out myself. But to now go to into sort of, this is what like live configuration might look like, right? So this is what, you know, an actual organization's configuration might look like. Okay, what about the actual like helper functions and the library piece of it? Well, that's where, you know, and I'm trying to kind of emulate Go style packaging for now, but obviously this could change or whatever. But we have stuff like, here is the build packs pipeline, right? And a lot of this stuff, for folks who are not super familiar with Q, and I'm not going to get too deep into it, is you can import stuff into Q directly. So if you have some YAML, you could just do Q import that YAML and it will convert it into Q. And then using some of the other Q functions, you can actually turn some of these things automatically into schemas. So it can, let's say, for example, say, well, this is a string. I know this is a string. So, you know, I can just sort of create a schema out of that. You know, there's some things in here just to kind of give you an idea of like, this defaults to the example build packs, but anybody can put in any string, right? So if somebody does not put in the name of an image, it defaults to example build packs, stuff like that. And then the other thing here that's kind of neat about how you can do this in Q is you can test a lot of stuff in Q by just sort of creating a folder called test, let's say, part of the same package, and you just if you would then call it in here, you would then you can then test it test that out. So catalog, pipelines, build packs, test. So if I were to do Q eval, it, you know, if let's say I change this from this to, let's say, a number, it will now actually, if it's, I think I need to do Q apply here. Yeah, here we go. Found an int want, you know, so, and once again, one thing I will say is the error messages in Q are not great here. But anyway, if I go over to the Go one here, this is what the Go one looks like. And then the other thing that we're trying to kind of start to define is we're trying to define like standards. So if I go over to the Fresca package or the Fresca pipeline package here, you can see we can define a pipeline any way we want, right? So in this, we can define a pipeline. And if I look at the pipeline for a second, a pipeline is a set of tasks assigned in a certain, you know, structure. And the tasks are some pre-build tasks, plus some build tasks, plus some post-build tasks. And for right now, I've left it pretty simple here, where the only requirement is that all pipelines must start with the official Fresca clone task, right? Or a subset of that task. Sorry, a sort of, not a subset, but a further constraint of that task, right? It has to like match the Fresca clone task schema. And so you might imagine, right, like as we're building something out, a secure pipeline task, or sorry, secure pipeline might include tasks that hit certain requirements, like you must include an SBOM generation task. You must include, you know, a secure publishing task and whatever, right? But because of this sort of makes it very easy for folks who are, let's say, building their own pipelines to sort of generate whatever they want. So if I look here, right, a pipeline input is relatively simple. And once again, for most folks, they don't have to look at this. This is mostly for folks who are developing on Fresca itself, or for people who want to generate some custom pipeline type for their specific need. But like the inputs here are just like, they look, you know, like you would call a function or something, and just sort of say, hey, this is a test pipeline, test image, yada, yada. So if I were to go into Fresca pipeline test, right? Baseline pipeline, or I think I might have. Yeah, that's why I recently changed some of the names of stuff. But you can see here, there's a bunch of stuff that it deploys, and so on. So actually, before kind of continuing, do folks wanted to kind of like, is there anything, does this seem like what we should be doing? Do folks have kind of a different opinion? Curious to hear like feedback if this seems like something we should be focused on.
I think the general idea is good. The part that I struggle with is basically redefining the whole task catalog and that kind of stuff. And how do that seems like a bit of a slippery slope to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I think on that front, we're trying to kind of figure out, as much as possible, we want to just sort of pull stuff directly from Tecton, but we also, like, some of the stuff that I think we've been noticing is we might not want to just pull whatever from Tecton if some of the folks will just sort of update a thing and not do the release and some of the other stuff there. I think
True.
I think we might want to do something like that, but there's two pieces. One is, obviously we need more support on this, because I think this is beyond just like a 2 or 3 of us kind of like maintaining that catalog. I think we would need to have something a bit more robust. But I think we would also want to make sure that, we would obviously want to coordinate with the Tecton folks to say, hey, look, we noticed this issue with the thing and we want to include it or not include it or whatever. But the other thing I think that might be useful from the Fresca side is, I think our catalog, if we had one, would be significantly smaller, right? We just sort of say, yep, because of how things are looking, right? Like, we're going to support, Go, we're going to support Python. If somebody wants to add, let's say, Java support, okay, great, you can add Java support. But I think the other thing too is we're not looking to kind of support like every different thing under the sun. We're looking to say, here is like a secure clone task, right? And so we're not going to support every cloning task. We're just going to support this secure one. And if folks want to come in and build their own, we can definitely do that. And I think some of the other stuff that kind of makes this nice is we can define, right? Like, we can define what a Fresca task is. And once again, this is obviously just super, trivial. This is just based on like how we import from, for folks who are also not super familiar with Q. Q can automatically support Kubernetes resources and custom resources. So you can just actually include custom resources like you would, let's say, a Go package, and it automatically is able to then, you can then feed in and it can match against that schema. So, you can go and say, hey, this is what, just as an example, this is what a pipeline, a Tecton pipeline task looks like. And if somebody were to come in and put in a value that doesn't match a pipeline, a Tecton pipeline task, that is no longer valid and wouldn't, quote unquote, compile, that kind of thing. You would get an error out of that. But because of that, it lets us go back and generate stuff like this is what a Fresca task looks like. And a Fresca task could potentially consist of these particular things. And so you must, in order to be a task, you must have these things. And so some of the things that we might be able to do, for example, is say all tasks must have images with pinned hashes. We do not allow folks to just sort of pin to a tag. You must pin to a hash, and we can actually enforce that at this level. So if somebody comes in with, hey, I want to generate a new Fresca task, and they just pin via the version, sorry, that doesn't that doesn't match the constraints, it won't work. But yeah, any other thoughts on that sort of thing?
Sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. Yeah, so Brad, I hear the concern. Is there a different approach you would take, or any way to avoid that issue? Because yeah, I know you don't want to be. It's definitely a risk.
Yeah, I think it's more around having a process or a way to easily pull in those tasks, or to automate that. If we're saying that our particular git clone task is going to somewhat match the Tecton one, right? Is there, a process, say at the time that we produce the Fresca release, whatever that is, for us to automatically do that, right? Based on which version of that git clone task that we're using. And then also I think Mike talked about it a little bit, but at least having a mechanism for other people to add their own particular flavor of whatever task that is, right? The Git clone task or whatever, and making that easy. I will say that some of the newer versions, the new version of Q is going to make it a little bit easier to determine what gets evaluated during when you're doing the Q evaluation, and not be so strictly hierarchical. And further going to doing the evaluation within Go sort of opens some more doors on what sort of flavors of the constraints that you want to pull in, and you won't be sort of stuck to this. You have to have certain constraints at the top level directory, some at the mid level directory, and then some at the lower level directory. You can sort of pull in sort of mix-ins as it will from so you could have like a command line option, say I want to include some post build test like this or some constraint like that, and it would automatically pull in that sort of mix in and put those constraints in when you're doing the overall evaluation to get the pipeline out of it. So I think that opens a lot of doors. I mean, it also opens a lot more complexity, but
Yeah, no, that actually sounds great, because I know one of the things, based on, I know one of the earlier diagrams was like, we I think we probably anticipate, there's going to be potentially orgs that are still global to the company, but maybe a little bit different. Like, you might have a team that's responsible for policy that has global policy for stuff, but then you might have a team that's responsible for security. And like, yeah, the global policy team doesn't really affect this security stuff, but the security team still is going to affect everything. And so you want to include that more as a mix in than necessarily like saying, well, security is maybe is a subset of the org level. I think that'll help out. And then also, yeah, there's a lot of do you know if when they're supposed to release that? Is it just Q 0.5 or something? Because I saw a couple of the beta
I was
versions.
hoping it was going to be soon. There's a community call next Tuesday, I believe. So I'm hoping to get some more details about that. It sounded like it was close at the last community call, which was late-ish November, I think.
Cool. Yeah. The other thing I did like, and maybe even the mix-ins would probably help here with some of the testing to be able to sort of mock stuff out and so on, is I do like sort of like the idea of if you can sort of verify, like, because like one of the other things that is very confusing about Q is like sometimes it can be very difficult to know, like, why am I not getting concrete values for everything? And this sort of thing helps out with some of those tests. It's still not perfect, but yeah. But as an example here for like a pipeline, somebody who wants to just include the Fresca build packs task into their pipeline, it's just something as simple as, hey, I have a list of build tasks and I just include this one. And because this one, because this Fresca build task is an official Fresca task, right? Like it meets those constraints defined by the Fresca task. Yep, that's valid. Great. And so if somebody were to come in with like a task that, doesn't meet those requirements, it wouldn't work, which is great. Yeah, I think the concerns from our end is always like, how easy is this going to be to actually implement? Like, are we going to have, are we going to have enough folks who know how to write Q to help out and build this out? I think because from our end, from folks who seem to be, reaching out in the Slack chat or even just, asking to have some chats about some stuff, who are looking at this, they did say, hey, like, nobody wants to move off of their CI system, right? Because everybody has too much complexity there. But a lot of folks are looking at something like a Fresca as either for greenfield environments of like, great, I don't need to use the old stuff and this thing just generates SBOMs for me and handles a lot of the heavy security stuff. That's pretty big. And then the other thing I think folks have been interested in is also sort of that general easy button and the ability here, right, where I don't think we want to push for this, right? But some folks have said, hey, could I make this just take over the build, scan, et cetera tasks, but my Jenkins still handles the QA pipeline, right? I think folks have sort of seemed interested in doing that. And it's not necessarily that I recommend it, but if that's the way folks are going to go, that might still be relatively reasonable. Because I think the thing that folks are recognizing is if they have to generate SBOMs on their own and enforce that and do all the various security scans and make sure that the SBOMs get published to all the right places and the things have the SALSA attestations and so on, I think they've some of them have sort of said that something like Fresca could help out there.
The other question I have on this whole thing is who exactly is the user for something like the command line? Like who's doing it? Because I think the one thing I want to make sure that we're clear on is I don't imagine, or again, well, this is a question. It's a poorly phrased question, but you know, I don't imagine a developer is likely to be using a like a Fresca command line that frequently, or if they are, we're probably missing something, or probably targeting the wrong level. Is that something that makes sense when I said it, or do you think a developer would be using a Fresca command line on a relatively frequent basis?
I guess I would envision it more as a
go ahead.
sort of onboarding the project or whatever to the build infrastructure, right? So more of a one-time thing to say, okay, this is my project. I want you to set up a pipeline to monitor it and build it when it changes, right? And not necessarily having the developer initiating the pipelines themselves after they make changes to their project, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
so it's more setting up the pipeline in the overall factory, if you will, right, for their particular project. And then after that, it's, you know, maybe some, if there's monitoring or, you know, other interrogation tools that you want to do, sort of like the Tecton CLI stuff, right?
Right.
To a certain extent.
Yeah, I guess my question though is even in a place like not to list any specific tools that anybody's using, but like, you know, even in somewhere like City, I think oftentimes you're likely to still have even another more abstracted interface or way to submit requests that folks typically use. So it seemed likely to me that this would still kind of still be abstracted away from the onboarding step, because that would you'd be and City is not alone in this. A lot of folks have a thing that they have to use to onboard to stuff. You know, like when I want to submit a request for something, I go to this site and I fill in some things, and then that submits a ticket. And on the back end, it might even just call this. But I can't find that many folks yet who would actually hit the button, like press the buttons directly. It seems like often there's still going to be a thing in front of it, which that might be too pedantic of a distinction, but I didn't imagine yet, even in that case, that it would be very often that someone would actually run it as a dev. Or I couldn't find it, but again, I could be missing something. I'm not speaking to the same kind of folks that you're speaking to. So I still think that this is incredibly valuable, even for that activity, because that part is still really hard. I'm just trying to spend a lot of time understanding who literally would be using it. Is it really an end user tool, or is it a thing that enables that last step to really be easy and maintainable? I'm not 100% sure yet where exactly that line is.
Yeah. I think another sort of set of users would be the people that are actually provisioning the factory itself, right? So that
Mhm.
taking a release of Fresca and getting it set up, and I think there's probably some value around putting a command line tools around that for picking out which pieces you want and where they go and that kind of stuff, rather than having to run through a bunch of bash scripts and stuff like that. I've done some playing with, abstracting out some of the versions and configuration stuff into Q, and that stuff is very POC, but I think there's still it still provides some of that same sort of value there, right? Where you abstract out some of those pieces and you just have to provide the specific differences that you have relative to sort of the vanilla setup.
Yeah, I think like whatever the command line tool ends up being, it's more of the API into Fresca, even if it's the deployment API in addition to other things as well. I think one of the things that I know folks have expressed concern about, right, is devs do not want a difference between what they're running locally and what they're running in CI as much as is possible, right? Because they don't want to kind of find out like, wait a second, I generated an SBOM locally and it looked like this, and then I generated it over in Fresca and I got something completely different that like has all these vulnerabilities. Like, how is this my fault? There's that sort of seeing, and so I know one of the things that like if I look at tools like Co and some of the other ones, right, is a lot of devs are very interested in that ability to just sort of say, great, I run this once, it's the same thing that runs in the actual build and yada yada. And so like I'm almost getting 100% of the identical stuff between the two. That's just not, once again, I'm not saying that there's a easy way to do this, but I know some folks have discussed like, could you run the same builds that are running in Fresca as a full-fledged thing? Could you run that locally? And I mean, the answer to some extent is yes, if you have Minikube and yada yada, but could we make that also easy so that folks know that like, before they get to the full-fledged Fresca, that actually the way they've structured this thing, the SBOM step is going to fail, because not because like the SBOM step is broken, but because the way they've developed their code, it just makes the SBOM stuff break or whatever. I think that's something that we need to kind of figure out to make it as easy as possible. Because yeah, I think to Tim's point, nobody actually wants to use any tool, right? Like no tool is better than a tool, because now it's another thing I need to think about. But if you can sort of say, hey, as a developer, I don't need to touch this except in this case, I think they'd be much happier. And that includes developers who are working on building out Fresca itself, right? Like I think we can imagine there's probably from an API standpoint, folks who are building out a Fresca deployment and building out their own stuff, they're going to want to be able to say, hey, Fresca new pipeline, and it generates a new pipeline in the catalog. Or Fresca new task and generates a task that automatically hits all the basics, and then using a couple of basic commands can, let's say, generate one that includes this command or that command without actually having to go into the queue itself.
I was wondering, as folks kind of ask these questions, right, and the target audience and all that. I mean, this is a very implementation specific kind of question, and I guess highly dependent on now the CI engine is tagged on, is that can we build some of those things to a native kind of CLD? So like, I mean, there's nothing new to learn, but then we encapsulate the details into the Kubernetes structure, right? Like the validation thing, the mutating things, and like the object definition, like from a Fresca task, for example.
Yeah, so I know a while back we looked at both operators and controllers as potentially some way to do this. And I know one of the problems became like when you have a bunch of custom resource definitions with themselves, their own operators and controllers, and then you have another one that tries to, like, we were running into some issues there. To be clear, like I think if that could still get done, and I don't know if there's been any sort of updates to that could make that a bit of an easier proposition, right? Tim, you tried some of that stuff out, right?
Yeah, but to that point, I think back to kind of the beginning of the conversation, like what exactly is a Fresco release? I think in doing a lot of the work, we did realize that things like Cert Manager, Vault, and a lot of the key management pieces are probably not part of a Fresco deployment, given that they likely have that already somehow. So you can, people might want to use KMS or maybe they already have their Vault, and it's not likely something that they're going to want out of the box anyway. That is where a lot of the complications were, because even I know Brandon's probably familiar with this too, right? Like installing Cert Manager in abstracting away like the install of a lot of those other components through your own thing basically forces you to try to reinvent how they do the install, and that's not really something that you really want to be touching. But the other pieces are far simpler, so it might be doable if you kind of, like we said, and it's probably worth following up on the next one if Sunny gives a demo on what he's been doing. But like, cleaving Fresca kind of in half and saying the deployable piece is the top part, pipelines, Spire agent, things like that. Like that might be doable. It might be worth revisiting. Like I said, the complicated part was that other layer, which, if you throw it away, it gets a lot easier.
So another thing is that I think there was some initial hope that Dagger was going to be sort of that thing that you're talking about, Sonny, where they were going to have some sort of abstract sort of build pipeline definition, and then from that be able to generate that for different sorts of environments, whether that's GitHub or Tecton or whatever. But I think there's still a lot of value to be gained from, or gems that they have in how they've done things, but they basically set up their own sort of build infrastructure that they use, right, to do their builds, and they can sort of wedge that inside of tech. It can run inside of Tecton, it can run inside of GitHub Actions, it can run inside of other things, but it doesn't really provide that sort of translation layer that I think you were alluding to.
Yeah, the Dagger stuff is pretty interesting what they've been doing. But I also know that like they've actually been trying to take a step away from Q, because I think they've recognized that, at least for what they were trying to do, it's quite difficult to kind of get some of the stuff done. And so they've switched to sort of more like, here's how to build pipelines using, let's say, a Python API or Go API and that kind of thing. I know that what they've set up, which is interesting, is they're using GraphQL behind the scenes as their actual model, so that you can say like, hey, this is this sort of command or whatever, and then based on different contexts, it can say, well, I know locally I just run this command, or locally I run this command in a container, remotely I run this command in a VM or whatever, or I think there's some interesting stuff that they've done there. I think the challenges though is, how do you like guarantee that's done safely and securely is a whole other thing. I think from a simplicity standpoint, that I think they've gotten that thing, and I think that would be something interesting to maybe see if there's some overlap, some areas we can collaborate on, because I think they've done some interesting stuff there, and they've solved like the simplicity problem, right? Oh, hey, I ran this locally and I ran it externally and it runs the same. The problem is just, yeah, but can you define a set of constraints, and can you sort of say that no, a developer can't come in and just say run rmrf/ on the CI box? Like that's what I couldn't seem to find. there. Whereas I think with what we're trying to do with Fresca is like, the idea should be, yes, this should be a secure build that matches all that.
Yeah, I think they were just wrapping right around build packs or something, or build kits, I think, right?
Well, yeah, they're doing a lot with build kit. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So it wasn't, even if it ran on Tecton, it was used build kits underneath it. Like, just okay, yeah, that's all it did.
Right. Yep.
But I think like in the point, I think introducing new tasks and new pipelines, I think we can have that as part of the, the PR, like have it automated check to see that, hey, it evaluates to the Fresca policies, the Fresca task, and matches everything. And then it's allowed in kind of thing. So as they're building it out via the CI, then once you push it in, it kind of double checks that everything looks good in terms of it matches the policies that have been set up, or the, what the Fresca task as definition is, it matches that. So that should, like, I think that was one of the concerns you were saying. We can probably automate all that kind of stuff. And keep building on top of the Fresca definition, as we see people trying to find loopholes around it, right? We can be like, hey, let's tighten that up even more. But yeah, I think in that case, we just like Mike and as Mike was saying, we just have a small subset of the catalog, right? Just like, hey, these are the things that we support, and not make it as grand as Tecton. So because we want to be opinionated right at this point, anyways.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we'd also want to kind of figure out soon is maybe via a survey or some sort of marketing outreach through the OpenSSF. Like, are folks sort of, how interested are folks in something like Fresca? Is Fresca always going to just be more of like a, hey, here's a POC around some of this stuff, but are folks actually interested in using Fresca as an actual tool for secure builds? Because I know from the Salsa side and some other sides, like a lot of folks are very interested in what Fresca is attempting to do. But I think when it comes to, who are the actual folks who are potentially adopters of Fresca, I think we'd be interested in seeing some more of that. So if folks know folks who are interested or whatever, we definitely also want to hear some more feedback from them.
I think those people would give us valuable feedback to the previous topic, is that like, how locked down do you want the task to be, right? And what do you want? Because I can tend to see that list of tasks can be organization specific if they were to run a Fresca. I mean, yeah, their definition of what I want may be different than this, and the definition of security, in a way, what they want to control may be different as well. Like, although fundamentally, yeah, you're cloning a thing that can be common enough for everybody, but like beyond that, yeah, I can see some, preferences, differences.
All right, cool. Any other questions, thoughts, things folks wanted to bring up?
Just want to give an update for the Tecton stuff. It is moving forward. So there's a guy named Prakash who's pushing the PRs forward for us on the Tecton side, on the Tecton pipelines and chains for the Spire work. So that is moving along. This is taking a long time still.
Yeah,
there's a lot of comments and everything. So
yeah, I wonder if that's something we can bring up to some of the CD Foundation, because at this point it's actually over a year since this work started, and there was a lot of pushback from the Tecton side on some of this. So yeah, let me reach out to some of the folks on the Tecton side as well, just to kind of say, hey, look, I know David was like, yeah, this is definitely a priority, and I know that it's moving along, but it's like,
yeah,
is it really a year's worth of work to sort of integrate Spire in there, especially given that like the majority of feature work took what, a couple of months.
Yeah, right. That, and it's also going to be released as an alpha, right? So it's not like it's enabled by default. You have to actually enable it and set it up and so forth. So it's not like it's going to break functionality out of the box or something. So yeah, it's not going to be a full-fledged release of it anyways until it's been tested and all that kind of stuff and moves out alpha. So, but yeah, so that's moving along. And then the runtime attestations, I think Brad attended it last time. Yeah, we're going to do we're going to push the attestation forward. So there's a meeting after this for the in toto, and we're going to push the runtime attestations into as a 0.1. So I'm going to get that pushed forward, and then we can always make revisions on it as we see fit. At the same time, I'm going to catch up with Natalia from Tetragon and from some of that work to get all that stuff incorporated into Tecton chains.
Cool. So anything else? All right, I'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Yeah, have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.